It was a real-life Lord of the Flies. 22 children left largely unsupervised and split into two groups. Within days, prejudice, mistrust, and slander had already sprung up between the two factions of children, and it almost ended in an unimaginable tragedy. In the summer of 1954, social psychologist Muzaffer Sharif transported a group of 22 boys to Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. This greatly unethical experiment would go on to inspire the infamous book Lord of the Flies just a year later, with repercussions for the subjects that would last their whole lives. Sharif was originally born in the Ottoman Empire prior to its collapse after World War I. His academic brilliance earned him a chance to study psychology at the world-famous Harvard, and he would go on to become one of the greatest psychologists of his generation. However, one experiment conducted on American school children tainted that reputation forever. Having lived through the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the rise and fall of Nazi Germany, even spending time in Berlin prior to the start of the Second World War, Sharif was fascinated by human psychology, and specifically why we carry out behaviors that we do. However, Sharif was quickly growing frustrated at the limitations of using animals to test out behavioral theories. One of these theories, currently just a seed in his mind during the early 1950s, was the realistic conflict theory. Sharif wanted to find out why groups behaved the way they did, and how prejudices, stereotypes, and outright hatred grew out of competition between groups for resources. Rats weren't intelligent enough to provide the answers Sharif needed, so he turned to children. In the summer of 1954, Sharif trucked 22 children to Robbers Cave National Park in Oklahoma. His plan was to split them into two groups and see how competition bred intergroup conflicts. The children were all 11-year-old boys who had a Protestant two-parent background. They were all above average or average academic performers and did not know each other. They were all also carefully selected so that when split into two groups, each group would have a balance of common physical, mental, and social talents to try and make the opposing sides as evenly matched as possible. Each of the two groups of 11 children were picked up by a separate bus so they would have no contact with each other, and were kept unaware of the other group's existence during the first phase of the experiment. As the children arrived to the sectioned off area of the park assigned to Sharif for the experiment, he set out to test two hypotheses. The first was that when individuals who don't know each other are brought together to achieve a common group goal, a group structure and hierarchy with clearly assigned roles will form. The second, much darker hypothesis was that once the two groups were brought into competition with each other, hostile attitudes would arise in each group versus the opposing group and be adopted by the group as a whole. However, Sharif also hoped to prove that two opposing groups would drop all prejudices to come together in the face of a shared disaster. In fact, he had already tried this experiment a year earlier but met with failure. Even after Sharif stole each group's clothing, smashed their toys and tents, and framed the opposing groups for it. That experiment was such a disaster that it ended with Sharif drunkenly threatening to punch one of his research assistants, while another assistant threatened Sharif with a block of wood if he threw that punch. The children had not just refused to turn on each other, but had actually bonded against their common enemy and figured out that Sharif and his staff were trying to pit them against each other. This time, things would be different. For the first 2 days of the experiment, the goal was to keep the groups unaware of each other's presence and allow the boys time to bond. This was done by presenting the children with challenges that required cooperation and group discussion to complete, as well as group activities such as hiking, swimming, and other recreational pursuits. In the previous experiment, the boys had been allowed to meet and mix together before being separated, and Sharif believed that this was to blame for the solidarity they showed, even as he tried to instigate intergroup hostilities. The groups ended up choosing their own names, the Rattlers and the Eagles, and designed their own flags. On day 3, the groups were finally brought together. Sharif had engineered a series of challenges that would pit one group against the other. This included tug-of-war, baseball, and other competitive events. To encourage competition and up the stakes, Sharif gave away prizes and even trophies after each challenge. The competitions continued for a series of days, with lavish praise and prizes awarded to the winning team and no consolation prizes to the losers. The competitive nature of the activities only served to heighten the sense of frustration for the losing side, which in turn quickly turned into resentment for the winners. And this was exactly what Sharif had been planning on. When the groups were told of an upcoming series of challenges, the Rattlers responded by proclaiming their absolute confidence in their ability to win. They even took over the baseball field, forbidding any Eagles from using it so that they could practice and improve their odds of winning. After much talk about coming up with a way to make it clear the Eagles weren't allowed to use the field, the Rattlers ended up hoisting their flag on the field itself and warned the Eagles not to touch it. Verbal warnings escalated into threats, much to Sharif's delight. But Sharif had not just set up a series of competitions, he was actively working to ensure that the two groups would foster true frustration and enmity toward each other. To that end, he engineered situations where one group would profit at the expense of the other, such as delaying the arrival of one group for lunch so that when they got there, the other group had eaten the best parts. This slow, insidious poisoning of attitudes between the two groups went over better than Sharif could have hoped for, and soon the two sides were calling each other names and levying taunts. The Eagles, looking to vent their frustrations, went to the baseball field and took down the Rattlers' flag. Then, egged on by one of the research assistants who provided the matches, the Eagles burned the flag. For the Rattlers, this was a bridge too far, and they immediately retaliated by invading the other group's cabins while they were out for the day. The Rattlers trashed the cabins, overturning beds and throwing the contents of each camper's luggage all over the floor. They even resorted to theft, stealing some of the Eagles' personal belongings. Once the Eagles discovered the sabotage and theft, they sought out the Rattlers and fistfights ensued, which the research staff had to quickly move to stop. It's important at this point to note that the boys and even their parents had no idea they were part of an experiment. As far as everyone knew, Sharif and the other research assistants were nothing more than ordinary camp counselors. Even when they directly intervened to feed the growing hostility between the two sides, such as by providing the Eagles with matches to burn the Rattlers' flag, the boys still had no idea they were being manipulated. Unlike the year before, when the campers slowly realized the research staff was trying to pit them against each other, this time nobody on the Eagles or Rattlers suspected a thing. Sharif's strategy of not allowing them previous contact until they met on the field of battle, or competition at least, had worked like a charm. With no opportunity to find common ground and individual group dynamics already in place after 2 days of bonding, each group was thoroughly and completely hostile to each other. Sharif enforced a 2-day cooling-off period after the physical confrontations over the burned flag and trashed cabins. During that time, he had each group come up with lists that characterized theirs and the opposing group. Perhaps unsurprisingly, each boy characterized their own group in very favorable terms, while using highly unfavorable terms to characterize the opposing group. Even with no history of prior delinquency or bad social behavior, in fact, the children had been explicitly selected because they didn't show either of those qualities, each group had managed to develop strong prejudice against the other, going so far as to directly question the moral character of the members from the opposing group. Now Sharif needed to prove that the groups could overcome their differences and work together to achieve a common goal, which threatened all. But first he had to reconcile the groups, or at least try to. To this end, Sharif brought the boys together in activities he hoped would bond them, doing away with the team competitive sports and activities and instead doing things like shooting off fireworks on the 4th of July, watching a movie together, and engaging in a bean collecting contest. However, even after several days of this, neither side was showing any true reconciliatory attitudes toward the other. But Sharif still had hope in his theory. He just needed to put the children in a situation where no one group acting alone could overcome the challenge presented. However, this challenge needed to have real consequences, at least in the mind of the children, and couldn't be a simple game or recreational activity. The children needed to be presented with a situation that threatened their very survival. Sharif moved the children out of their old campsite to a brand new one, hoping that the new environment would lessen the memory of previous hostilities. At the new site, the children's drinking water came from a reservoir atop a hill not far from the camp, and one day the staff blocked off the flow of water. They blamed the loss of water on vandals, and the children, still segregating themselves by groups, set out to find the source of the stoppage. Arriving at the reservoir, they found that the faucet had been blocked, and the children dropped their differences and worked to resolve the problem together. After almost an hour, the blockage was cleared, and the Rattlers even allowed the Eagles, who didn't have their canteens with them, to go ahead and drink the water first. All seemed well, but later that evening, the groups inevitably split back up into their two opposing camps and launched a food fight. Encouraged by the cooperation, Sharif then set up a scenario where the boys needed to work together to procure a film that they wanted to watch. Getting a copy of Treasure Island, the research staff informed the children that the camp couldn't afford to pay for the film on their own, and that if the children could raise $3.50 from each group, they would cover the rest. Eventually, the total sums were raised, even though the total contributions from each member in each group was unequal. The children had come together over their shared goal of securing a movie they very badly wanted to watch. That night at dinner, there was no food fight, and other than a few small provocations, the children got along relatively peacefully. Sharif then threw subsequent challenges at the children to prove that in the face of a common threat or goal, the groups would come together. On the last day of the camp, at both breakfast and lunch, the groups had largely disintegrated and children sat together no matter their previous affiliation, something unthinkable just 3 days before. In the end, Sharif had proven his theory. Or had he? His research was almost immediately criticized as not just highly unethical but also extremely biased. First, the children had been left largely unsupervised during the whole affair so they could develop their independent group dynamics, even when at one point the Eagles loaded up socks with rocks with which to beat back the rattlers should they find them raiding their cabins. The staff did nothing, only stepping in once violence actually began. But Sharif's research methods were extremely flawed. As has been noted, he didn't set out to test his theory but to prove it. He purposefully engineered the entire experiment to get his desired result, even taking time to make sure that the children had time to reconcile before testing if they truly would work together on a life-threatening superordinate goal of restoring drinking water. His interference in providing a lighter to the Eagles so they could burn down the Rattlers' flag and sabotaging the group's lunchtime so that one group would get little food because the other had eaten it all was also not just unethical but highly unscientific. Lastly, the boys all shared a common background. They were all white and came from Protestant two-parent homes. This alone was an elementary mistake and flawed methodology that should have been obvious from the onset. In the end, while there might be some truth to the fact that groups may drop past differences to work for a common good or combat a common threat, real human society is far too nuanced to be mirrored by this simplistic experiment. Given the extreme ethical issues in creating a realistic testing of Sharif's theories, though, it's likely we'll have to leave the question to historians and philosophers. Now go check out Human Sleep Experiment that went horribly wrong, or click this other video instead.